Hey everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of the video. As you know from previous, I had to cut this in half because it ended up being double the length that I was hoping. So today we are going to cover the fantasy books from the 1970s into and up until 2019. This is obviously where the choices get a lot more difficult, and also just deciding what to include in the video. I felt like I had to shift away from just fantasy that was being published to really major works of fantasy, or works of fantasy that I felt really changed the genre as a whole or had a particularly big cultural or societal impact. So again, I could not include everything. I'm sure there are huge omissions. Some of your favorite books are probably not on here. I invite and would actually really love to hear everybody's opinions about what they personally would have included, what you feel like should absolutely be included, and I can't wait to talk to you all about that in the comments. But I will let us get started, and we will start off with an examination of the books from the 1970s. If we move into the 1970s, we were starting to move a little bit further away from the success of The Lord of the Rings, and fantasy publishers were still looking for a lot of the same. A lot of the same types of tropes, a lot of the same types of story setup. This is where we started to see a lot of those fantasy stories that continued to, I think, push the genre forward, but were still relying on a formula that publishers knew would sell. Fantasy was definitely gaining traction, but we had not yet reached a point where you were guaranteed a place in the publishing world if you were doing things that were completely original. That being said, there were a lot of classics of fantasy that were released in the 1970s, a lot of really important works that, even if they did have their basis in Tolkien and they did rely on a lot of what we now view as very classic fantasy tropes, we can't understate the importance or the impact that they had on the genre as a whole. So in the 1970s, we had one of my favorite moments for fantasy or speculative fiction or fantasy/horror with Stephen King releasing some of his first novels. Obviously, his first book, Carrie, came out in the 1970s, and while you wouldn't call this straight fantasy, it does incorporate some fantastical elements. We also had the release of The Shining and The Stand, which again toe the line of horror, but still, I think, do wear their fantasy influences, and can, I think, be considered books that definitely had an impact on the development of the genre. We got a lot of those stories, like I said, that follow what we now view as very classic fantasy tropes. With the release of The Nine Princes in Amber, we had Lord Foul's Bane, which some could argue was the beginning of the grimdark subgenre, with the character of Thomas Covenant being one of the earliest examples that we can find of that really morally corrupt protagonist who has to struggle against his baser urges. We also had the release of The Sword of Shannara, so that would go on to spawn a huge series of novels, which has only recently ended. We had The Silmarillion, the next installment of the Tolkien Legendarium, and we also had the rise of some really well-known female fantasy authors, including Patricia McKillop with The Riddlemaster of Hed and The Forgotten Beasts of Eld. And then we had Mary Stuart with her Arthurian books, beginning with The Crystal Cave. And those, we had some books that followed in the same steps as the kind of fairy tale-esque fantasy that came before. So we have Watership Down, that very much fits into that fantastic, nature-based fantasy story. But we also had Anne Rice's first installment in her Vampire Chronicles, which would sow the seeds to go on to really start urban fantasy and that blending of fantasy horror that will become a lot more popular in the years to come. So the 1970s were a huge decade for the furthering of fantasy. I think in terms of publishing, there was still a little bit of hesitancy about what to publish and whether books that deviated from that Tolkien formula would be able to succeed. But regardless of any constraints in that way, I still think that we had a lot of fantastic books in that span of 10 years. Moving into the 1970s, so this is the introduction of my favorite author, Stephen King, where he gets onto technically the horror field, but I feel like a lot of his books do have an element of fantasy in them. There is magic, there is the supernatural, there are very common fantasy tropes that come up in some of his books, especially The Stand. This was a difficult, so they're getting more difficult now. So the choices are starting to weigh on my mind. It's hard for me to pick a favorite because we've reached the time where I have read a lot more of the books, and a lot of the books had a big influence on me. Like The Sword of Shannara, which I've talked about on the channel, isn't the, objectively, if one can even use that word, the best fantasy ever. No, but it was hugely influential for me in terms of what I wanted to pick up, how I learned to like or dislike certain tropes. Huge part of my life. I read so many books by Terry Brooks. This was just a decade that was full of amazing selections. We have The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart, one of my favorite books of all time. Those are my favorite Arthurian retellings. I love Mary Stewart. I love her books. But the best book for me that was published in the 1970s undoubtedly has to go to Watership Down. This book, which you could call middle grade, but it is brutally violent at times, which follows a group of rabbits, has a piece of my heart forever. It has been a long time since I reread it, and I really am looking forward to rereading it sometime soon. I read this for the first time. It was one of the very first adult books that I ever read. I was around 7 when I read this for the first time, and I have reread it many, many times since. I love the book. I love the adaptation. I love everything about it. If you have never read Watership Down, go read it. It is a standalone fantasy novel. Unless you hate anthropomorphized animals, I mean, you're setting yourself up for failure. It's about rabbits. But if you don't mind that setup, go read it. If you don't like it, you can come back and yell at me and tell me that my opinions are dumb. But I have such confidence in this book. I love it so much that I feel like everyone should read it. Just everybody go read it. It is the clear winner for the 1970s. Feel free to argue with me about that, but I will give it the title to no other book. The Watership Down is the fantasy book for me of the decade of the 1970s. The 1980s. This is, I guess, what we think of presently when you're on BookTube or you're in the book world. When we think of classic fantasy tropes, we tend to think of the types of books and the types of characters that were written in those novelizations in the 1980s. This was, I think, again, a very big decade for fantasy. We saw the beginnings or the real development of heroic fantasy as a subgenre. We started to explore some stories that deviated a little from that epic, really buttoned down fantasy that we were getting in the past, and we were able to expand the horizons a little bit. There was also the development of the fantasy subgenre that was centered around Dungeons and Dragons and the types of books that came out of those role-playing setups. So again, huge, massive amount of titles, and it starts getting more difficult the further we go along to include everything, because you know, the fantasy genre has been growing over the last 100 years, and thankfully every decade there is just more and more that you can include on these types of overviews. But in terms of particular importance, we had the rise, like I said, of books like the Dragonlance Chronicles and the Legend of Drizzt fitting into that more role-playing style of fantasy. We had Glenn Cook's Black Company being printed, and really, I guess, going off of the Thomas Covenant books that had been written in the decade previous, we started to get that development of that grim, dark subgenre, those darker stories that obviously audiences had been craving because they've only been gaining popularity over the decades. We also had really important works of classic fantasy, including the Lioness Saga by Jack Vance. We had the Belgariad books by David Eddings. I know that's a particular favorite for a lot of people who are, or was a particular first favorite for a lot of people who are reading fantasy now. We had the Dragonbone Chair, which was published in the 1980s. David Gemmell, a huge juggernaut of European heroic fantasy, published his book Legend in the 1980s. In terms of Stephen King, he really started to lean into his fantasy influences with the publication of The Gunslinger in 1982. And again, we saw the further development of the young adult fantasy genre with such installations such as Redwall and Howl's Moving Castle. If we want to look a little bit more at literary fantasy, we had Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun that was published in the 1980s, and we also had Terry Pratchett's Discworld starting in that decade. So massively influential series that had their beginnings in the 1980s. And much like the decades that came before, there were lots of installations that came out in the 1980s that went on to be expanded upon and create series that would continue on into the 90s, into the 2000s, but they had their beginnings in this decade. We were still seeing a lot of those classic romantic or heroic tropes, but there were the seeds of what would go on to become very defined subgenres in fantasy. We could see those starting to begin and starting to pop up. So hugely influential titles being released in the 1980s. The pain of trying to pick the books now is so real. So many good books published in the 1980s. So many that I think a lot of fantasy readers look back on with heaps of nostalgia. This was, like I said, the rise of heroic fantasy, of epic fantasy. There was still a lot of Tolkienisms happening. There was a lot of inspiration and influence that was still being drawn from Tolkien, but I think that fantasy had really established its foothold by the 1980s, and I think that people were starting to move in different directions. Books with characters who weren't quite as generic, characters who did things that we didn't really expect, narratives that grew and changed in ways that we hadn't seen before. I think all that was just starting to come out into the world by the time we got through the 1980s. But there was a book that was released in the 1980s that mashed so many genres, that changed the landscape of fantasy for me, changed my reading life forever, and that was The Gunslinger, which was released in 1982. And it is the only choice that I could have possibly made for this decade. The Gunslinger on its own is one of my favorite books of all time, which is not only unpopular in the fantasy community, but is also unpopular in the Tower Junkie community. There's so many people who love The Dark Tower who feel like The Gunslinger is a lesser addition to the series, to which I say, nonsense. I love The Gunslinger. Never has a book been able to transport me to the setting instantaneously as easily as The Gunslinger. It has everything I love about fantasy. It has an animal companion. It has a coming of age element. It has a brutal landscape. It has a character that we really struggle to understand. It has that mix-mashed melange of genres that is so difficult to fit your head around the first time that you read it. I love this book so much that when people talk about it being boring or confusing or not good, it just doesn't compute to me. Obviously, I respect your opinion, but I just don't understand it. I really don't get it when people say that they don't like The Gunslinger, because that's how much I love it. And it is my gold standard for fantasy, published in the 1980s, my favorite book that was released during this decade, and I will not change my mind on that. We have reached the 1990s, so I think that you could make the argument, I think a lot of people would support the argument, that the 1990s gave us the first installations of some of the most beloved fantasy series of all time. And this includes in the adult fantasy genre and in the young adult fantasy genre. I guess those aren't really genres, but categorizations. If we're talking about adult fantasy or young adult fantasy, we got some of our biggest and most beloved works in the 90s. Obviously, probably one of the best written and most beloved fantasy series of all time, Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire had its start with the release of Game of Thrones in the 1990s. But we also had the beginning of Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings with the Farseer trilogy being published in the 1990s. We had Gardens of the Moon just kind of sneaking in there at the end of the decade in 1999. We had super influential authors such as Neil Gaiman and Guy Gavriel Kay having releases with Neverwhere and Tigana in the 1990s. We had Harry Potter, so one of the fantasy series to have the biggest influence on the publishing industry in recent years. The first book came out in 1997, and we also had The Golden Compass, the His Dark Materials series that was also a very influential and a children's series that I believe stands the test of time, that was released in the 1990s. We had works such as Daughter of the Forest, relying once again on that historical fairy tale based fantasy setup. So we also had, and this is of particular importance this year with the adaptation coming out, we had the first installation of Robert Jordan's epic fantasy series with The Eye of the World being released in the 1990s. So this was a hugely influential decade for modern fantasy. A lot of the series that are still ongoing or that have concluded relatively recently had their start in the 1990s. This, I think, it really gave publishing that boom that it needed. You cannot, whatever your opinions on Harry Potter in the present time, you cannot downplay the impact that that book series had on publishing as a whole, but especially for the development of the middle grade and the young adult subgenres. Huge influence, and of course had its start in the 1990s. So there are too many books that were released in this decade to possibly talk about in a short clip, but I believe that those are some of the biggest highlights that came out during that decade. The 1990s, this is the decade that almost broke me. Trying to pick a book. And it's hard because I think this is definitely an answer. A lot of these answers would have been fairly static throughout my whole life. Like Watership Down, I've always loved. A Wrinkle in Time, I've always loved. The Gunslinger, I've always loved. But the books that were released the next couple of decades that I'm going to talk about, the 90s, the 2000s, 2010s, or mostly the 90s and the 2000s, because the 2010s were pretty recently. But for those 2 decades, the things that I have loved have changed as I have continued to change and grow. And, you know, my mind is a different place than it was when I was in the 90s and I was, you know, a 12-year-old or whatever. So there would have been a time in my life where I would have undoubtedly said that Harry Potter was my selection as favorite fantasy novel from the 1990s. There are other books that were released in the 90s that I just think are so hugely influential, so different from anything that has come before, so important for the development of the fantasy genre that I can wholeheartedly say that I believe they are the best books to have been released in that decade. But the book for me that at this point in time captures the title of favorite it has to be Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, which was released in 1996, and it is the second book of the Farseer trilogy, and it is my favorite book of the Farseer trilogy, and the Farseer trilogy is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. I think that this book it's so good. It has so many of the things that I love. I am so attached to Fitz as a character that it is really difficult for me to not want to pick Robin Hobb as the answer for like every fantasy question I ever answer. But I just love it so much. I think Robin Hobb definitely relies on a lot of classic fantasy tropes. I don't think a lot of the world building or a lot of the plot structure is necessarily new or innovative in the way that, let's say, like Game of Thrones, which was released in this decade, is. I think that her character work is exquisite. I think that you are hard-pressed to find anybody who develops characters better than Robin Hobb. But regardless of the barometer by which we're measuring these books, Royal Assassin is one of the most enjoyable reading experiences that I have ever had. I loved every moment of reading those books. I wanted to instantly go back and reread Royal Assassin once I had read it. It gave me several of my favorite fantasy characters of all time, and it will have to be my selection. This was probably the hardest one. This was my most difficult choice of all of these decades, but it will have to be Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. So we move along into the 2000s, and obviously we have a continuation of some of those huge series that we talked about from the 1990s. So Malazan Book of the Fallen, The Wheel of Time, Realm of the Elderlings, Discworld. These were all series that continued along into the 2000s and continued to influence the people who are writing fantasy right now, continued to help fantasy as a genre gain popularity, but also gain, I think, critical acceptance. The 2000s is when I think fantasy began to convince people that this was a genre that was worth academic study. This was a genre that was worth paying attention to. And along with the continuation of some of those really well-known series, we also had the rise of Brandon Sanderson as an independent fantasy author with the release of Elantris and Mistborn in the early 2000s. We had one of the most influential urban fantasy series starting in the 2000s with Stormfront by Jim Butcher. Young adult fantasy continued to have its moment with the continuation of the Harry Potter series, also with the release of the Percy Jackson series, and of course, despite the fact that it is one of the most disliked series, we also have to acknowledge the role that Twilight played in the development of young adult fantasy, especially in the realms of paranormal romance and young adult paranormal fantasy, but Twilight definitely had its influence, and that was released near the end of that first decade of the 2000s. In terms of other subgenres, we began to see the beginnings of that kind of genre blending mixture called weird fantasy, with the release of Perdido Street Station, and we had some literary installments like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and of course probably one of the most well-known debuts from that decade would have been Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind. So again, a lot of really big titles being released in the 2000s. We're starting to see a little bit of a shift away from that formulaic fantasy. See a lot of authors beginning to experiment with style, with character, with prose, and I think really starting to see the rise in appreciation of what fantasy has been all along. So 2000 and 2009, like I said, lots of continuations of epic series that we have been enjoying from the 1990s, a lot of new debuts, a lot of new directions and interesting places for fantasy to go. But for me, and I know that this is a very generic answer, I'm sure, but my favorite fantasy book that was published between 2000 and 2009 is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And this is a difficult book series to talk about because a lot of people have really passionate opinions about The Name of the Wind, or you have a lot of people who have become apathetic toward this series because of its stasis right now. And I think that those are valid concerns. Those are things that I can tell that people have been very disappointed or very let down by a series that they enjoyed so much. But this is, for me, I cannot parallel with another book that was written in that 10-year span. Nothing else reaches the experience I had when I read The Name of the Wind. I don't think, so I'm trying to remember what year I read The Name of the Wind. It had gained a little bit of traction by the time I read it. Like, I didn't read it the year that it was released. I think it had been out for a couple of years. People were starting to talk about it, but it did not have this huge following, this huge acclaim that it has right now. And it felt so wonderful. It felt fresh in terms of the writing, but it felt familiar in lots of ways. There were a lot of classic tropes that I enjoyed. There were a lot of characterizations that I really enjoyed, archetypes that I enjoyed seeing in this novel, but it was just such a warm and welcoming and wonderful experience. It brought me back to caring about adult fantasy. Not caring about, because I guess I never didn't care about adult fantasy, but I had stepped away from reading it while I was in university and I was very, very busy. And it brought me back to wanting to read more adult fantasy, which was hugely influential and a big turning point in terms of my adult reading life. And would I like to see the series finished? Of course I would. I would love to see how this ends. I would love to see how everything wraps up. I do find it difficult. I try to compartmentalize and push that part away. It is hard not to have the ending of the series, but that doesn't detract from how much I enjoy it. And I know that's how a lot of people feel about A Song of Ice and Fire as well. It doesn't minimize the love that I have for the series, but I would like to see it finish someday. And regardless, it is my favorite fantasy book that was released between 2000 and 2009. And the last decade that I'm going to cover in this video would be the 2010s, so from 2010 to 2019. And it's difficult. The closer we get to present time, the harder it is to say what is going to go on and be a classic of that decade, because we're not far removed from 2019. This was only a couple of years ago, and while there are tons of titles that have gotten a lot of buzz, there are authors that have made a splash, it's difficult to see which authors are really going to have that, where their influence is going to be felt along the decades. It's easy for us to look back, to be retrospective, to examine what has gone on to influence future authors, what has gone on to really leave its footprint in the realm of adult fantasy or young adult fantasy, fantasy as a whole. But there are some titles that definitely stand out in terms of quality, stand out in terms of doing something new or exciting with the genre, or stand out just in terms of pure enjoyment. We had the continuation of some of that weird fantasy with Jeff Vandermeer starting to release some of his books, Annihilation being a particular favorite from the 2010s. We had the release of the First Law trilogy. First Law, I believe, started in the early 2000s, but continued along into the 2010s. We had the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, which many people believe is going to go on to be one of those bastions of adult epic fantasy. It is just something so massive in scope, in ambition, and it seems like, though I have not read it myself, it seems to be executing its purpose very well. So we had the beginning of such a huge series in the landscape of epic fantasy. We had, continuing on in epic fantasy, we had John Gwynn's Faithful and the Fallen series that was released during this decade. But we also saw the rise of some other subgenres, such as Flintlock fantasy, with The Promise of Blood being released. And we started to see a lot more experimental work, and work that was more representative of the human experience than fantasy that we had seen in decades previous. Fantasy had been a fairly homogenous group of stories, if you look at what was particularly mainstream. But in the 2010s, like onward, is when we started to see that really evolve and change. We had releases such as the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, the beginnings of the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. We have Black Leopard, Red Wolf that was released in the 2010s. And we also had a rise of very low fantasy fairy tale retellings. So we had Madeline Miller's installations with The Song of Achilles and Circe. We saw series such as the Winter Night trilogy and books by Naomi Novik like Spinning Silver that really brought back the classic feeling of fantasy, that wistful fairy tale imaginative story that people have been loving over the decades. In young adult fantasy, we saw a huge explosion of different types of stories, from The Ember and the Ashes to Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which went on to become hugely popular and hugely influential in the young adult fantasy sphere. And we continue to see young adult fantasy grow at an astronomical rate. This is an area of publishing that just seems to get bigger and bigger. So a lot of excellent books being released in the past decade, but it is hard for me to say, or hard for anyone to say, I think, what is going to be the most influential, because we simply have not spent enough time away from this previous decade to know what is going to be long lasting. But that is still a huge collection of phenomenal books that will be very difficult to whittle down to one favorite. The final decade, and this one is the most difficult for me to choose, because I feel like for a lot of these books that there hasn't been ample time for them to sink in. like books that I really, really enjoyed, like the Faithful and the Fallen series, for example. I binge read all those books this year. And did I love them? Yes, I devoured them. I enjoyed everything about them. I love the characters. I know that I'll go back and reread them someday. But I am several months removed from how much I enjoyed those books. For a lot of the books on this list, I am decades removed from the first time that I read them, and I still love them. I still hold them in such high regard. And so I know that I'm making the right choice when I'm selecting my favorite book from some of those decades. For this most recent decade, I don't know. Is it going to change? Is it not going to change? I'm not sure. But the book that I did end up selecting was Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles, which was released, I think, in 2011, and I believe I read it in 2012 for the first time. This is another one that kind of like, is it fantasy? Is it historical fantasy? Is it historical fiction? I mean, there's centaurs in it. I don't think, we can't call that historical fiction. Centaurs did not exist. So there is some element of the fantasy there, of the fantastic. I am going to include it as my fantasy pick. You can feel free to argue that it does not belong with the other books on this list. That is, up to you. That is your choice. But it is one of my favorite books of all time. I have read it in the last 10 years, as I said when putting together another video. It is the book that I have reread the most over the past decade. I just love it. I love the story. I love the mythology. I love the writing. I love the character exploration. It's just a beautiful, beautiful, sad book. And if books are beautiful and sad, then they usually get me, because that's what I like. That's what really tugs at the heartstrings. And The Song of Achilles is one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful books that I have ever read, and I love it every single time that I reread it. So it was the obvious choice for me, even though I think there's a lot of fantastic books that I read from this past decade. I need some time to sit on them. The Song of Achilles I read fairly early, and I've read it enough that I know I love it. Some of the other books that came out in this past decade, I'm going to need some time. I'm going to let them sit for a little while, and if I come back and think about this, years in the future, if I think about the same topic, I'm sure that some of the answers will change, but I also think that my love of the Song of Achilles will endure. So that is my selection for the final decade. And that ends the video. That ends the selections. I would love to know what you think of the books that were included. Any, like I said, glaring omissions. I am one person who knows not everything about fantasy, so I would love to know if there's anything you feel like really belonged on the list that didn't end up there. I would love to know what you think of some of my choices, and I would love to know what some of your choices would be. Is there a decade where you haven't read a lot of fantasy and there's some things that you would like to read and kind of fill in that gap in your fantasy knowledge? Or do you not really care about backlisted books and you just want to see what is new and developing? Fantasy is evolving all the time. I think that we are moving in a very positive direction in terms of expression and ingenuity and imagination and representation. There's so much fantastic stuff happening in the realm of fantasy right now, and I am very excited to see where it goes. But I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I will see you with another one soon. Bye!